Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to see so many familiar and distinguished, and as one gets older oneself, distinguished and familiar faces in the crowd out there. And also so many of the new generation. This wasn't actually something I was going to say, but you mentioned the way in which the British school is a place where one begins as an archaeologist, as an idealist, who's someone who wants to work in this field and to change things and to make things happen. And really, the value of a place like this is it can give you opportunities that you would otherwise never dream of, to meet people, to join projects, to learn things in a way that would be otherwise impossible. So it is indeed extraordinary to be back here. I think almost, my maths is really bad. Colin Renfrew once said the days of the innumerate in archaeology are numbered, and I've so far managed to survive. But it's nearer 30 than 20 years since I first came here. In fact, I think it's 31, almost to the day. I would also like to thank my own dear friend, colleague, and co-director on Cyprian Broodbank for an exceptionally generous introduction, and I think I would reciprocate by saying Cyprian would not be whatever it is, at least our project would not be whatever it is, were it not for her extraordinary input and transforming effect on the project and the way we think about prehistory and material remains and archaeology in general. I'd also like to thank the British School for the invitation to come out and to speak to you tonight, and of course the British Academy who have funded this visit from the UK. This is of course a lecture about the past, but I think it might be interesting to begin in the present with a glance at the future and to start with a very simple, often made observation. It's simply this: we live on a predominantly blue planet. 71% salt water and rising. We live on that planet in ever-changing ways. Within a few decades, if current warming conditions continue, there will be ice-free cruises to the North Pole. Already the northern passages around Russia and America that killed so many Renaissance explorers are seeing burgeoning traffic. The boom times of places like Anchorage and Archangel are just beginning. In terms of current geopolitics, the Obama administration's much vaunted and now somewhat compromised eastward pivot reflects the realization that the future, the strategic future, lies not in the Middle East and its little adjoining seas and other waters, but in the seas around China, where ways of drawing lines between states decided during the brief age of recent Western hegemony confront far older and in a sense much more ineffable claims of Chinese dominance that go back 2,000-3,000 years. How do we get to be in this world? Looking further back certainly helps. The West as it exists today is largely, extraordinary sound. I thought I was under heavy machine gun fire for a minute. That can come later, I'm sure, and will come later. But I've hardly begun. It's too early to start on that. The West, as it exists today, that's a good cue for the machine guns to open up, is largely, of course, the creation of an Atlantic world forged really only over the last 500 years or so. And arguably, the Atlantic was the last of the three great oceans to be stitched together by people. And indeed, could we actually have the front of the chandelier lights off? Is that something we can manage? But I think the slides will show better then. This projection is the projection I use when I'm teaching my students world prehistory. It's a far better and more truthful one for understanding the pattern of most of our planet until the very recent centuries before the present than the more familiar one, which puts NATO right in the middle of the map, the Atlantic, in a sense, as a core, and the Pacific is divided. This is really the way that world prehistory, the peopling of the planet, has worked for much of the past. A few insights into the really quite limited pre-Columbian activities we see around the Atlantic world. The Phoenician activity around the mouth of the Mediterranean in what's often called the Mediterranean Atlantic, the activity that people like Barry Cunliffe and others have explored along the Atlantic facade from Iberia through the British Isles up into the North Sea and Scandinavia. The loop from about 1000 AD of Viking exploration that we now know reaches not simply Iceland and Greenland, but also touches on, very briefly, the New World, with archaeologically attested remains of Viking houses built with cannibalized Viking longship nails on the coast of Newfoundland today. And then a few little kind of circles down the New World, the main one, of course, being the Caribbean, which becomes an interesting cockpit of island activity from about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and a tiny circle just to remind you that any of you who've been to Nantucket or to Martha's Vineyard, in fact, were preceded by early pre-Columbian travellers. But if you were to look at that map in general, it's a remarkably modest map of Atlantic connections that brings alive how much the last few hundred years have changed that. Now, as I mentioned, the Atlantic is the last of the great oceans, really, to go through this. That process began in the Pacific between 1 and 2 millennia earlier at the hands of Polynesian navigators, originating in the islands of Southeast Asia, whose chickens, or rather whose chicken bones, we are now starting to find in the archaeological middens of sites in coastal Chile. Some of the best evidence that they really did get right the way across the Pacific Ocean, by about 1200 AD at the very latest. In fact, an even earlier start is likely around the Indian Ocean, affected by people who are still almost archaeologically invisible to us, but who must lie behind such extraordinary circumstances as the Eastern, Southeast Asian, Austronesian ancestry of the languages of Madagascar, one of the most extraordinary and unintuitively comprehensible or expectable pieces of language mapping that we have in the world. Just 100, 150 kilometers off the African continent, a language that's come from the other side of the Indian Ocean. New work being done. This is a rather complicated map from a recent article by a London colleague, Dorian Fuller, and other colleagues of his, mapping out the names for outrigger canoes and some of the expanding evidence for early crop movements around the Indian Ocean 5,000, 4,000 years ago. No wonder then, and of course rightly so, the so-called thalassological turn among global historians. But where and when did this decisively important phenomenon of maritime worlds and ecomenes actually begin? There are, of course, many answers in time and space, but alike they lie much earlier than most of us imagine, in time periods where history must be written through archaeology, if it's to be written at all, by so-called, quote-unquote, prehistorians. Incidentally, a term that the more we think about it becomes a very, very bizarre term indeed. And they concentrate, unsurprisingly, around encouraging coastlines, and above all, around the planet's inner seas. Many, although not all of them shown here, places ideally located to encourage precocious exercises in maritime connection, to create, if you like, a blueprint for later oceanic voyaging and civilization, a blueprint for a blue planet. And that, in case you wondered if you were in the wrong lecture, brings us at last to the Mediterranean. Less than 1% of global sea space. Not always the earliest off the starting block, by every criterion, but by far the most richly evidenced arena, and practically unmatched in the speed and the extent of its cultural and economic takeoff, which of course culminated in the greatest empire of antiquity, Rome. In world history, there's really no doubt that the Mediterranean societies, plus their direct and often extremely indirect cultural impact, have punched far above their superficially predictable weight. Or, to put it in a more poetic sense, as did the self-styled Eilermain and Philhellene Lawrence Durrell, the Mediterranean is an absurdly small sea. The length and the greatness of its history make us dream it larger than it is. Wish I could write like that. It's great writing. Now, of course, the first half of Durrell's paradox rather depends on whether you're a Neanderthal or a Phoenician. Even in the 16th century AD, the Mediterranean was on average still 60 to 80 days long, which is a nice way of measuring space, incidentally, a far more useful way of thinking about space than simply distance on an atlas spread out on a table. So once upon a time, in a sense, not so small in terms of experienced space. The second half of the paradox is, however, pretty well undeniable. The length and greatness of its history make us dream it larger than it is. Once we look at the Mediterranean in comparative global perspective more closely, we start to appreciate what a remarkable and, in certain respects, genuinely unique theatre it really is. Firstly, It is, by most measures, the world's largest inland sea. Moreover, the latitudinal alignment, the east-west alignment, favours very high transferability. So a good idea that works in one part has a very good chance of working somewhere else. Cereals, olives, vines, sheep, but also the ways of life hardwired in with them, stemming from them. Perfume, symposium, Penelope at her loom. And in a sense, to underline how important and rare that is, let's have a look at the contrastive picture from the Baltic. One could also use a Japanese archipelago, which illustrates the opposite scenario, the gain in terms of north-south, complementarities. In this case, for example, Arctic furs for German grain. In fact, of course, the Mediterranean has a great habit of, as we say in English, having its cake and eating it. In other words, it gets it both ways. The Mediterranean gets its complementarity in vertical stacking through the extraordinary tectonic creations of these mountain ranges that rise from sea level to 2,000, 3,000 meters in extraordinarily tight lateral distances. And I've illustrated that both by that lovely view of the White Mountains, the Lefka Ori, taken from the south coast of Crete, and more sketchy but very interesting still, that cross-section of another extraordinary Mediterranean mountainscape, the coast of Phoenicia rising up into the skyscraping towers of Lebanon, halfway down again into the hanging valley of the Bekaa, home of Hezbollah at the moment, then rising into anti-Lebanon, down into the Syrian steppe and off into the desert, and all within 100, 150 kilometers of the coast. This is an extraordinary environment, and I think living in it and working in it, we've become, in a sense, anaesthetized, over-familiarized with what an extraordinary place it is. Second, and building upon the environmental dimension, it's only one of 5 specifically and strictly environmentally or climatically Mediterraneoid, awful word, regions in the world. And it's easily the largest for all kinds of good reasons that I can't go into now. They're largely meteorological. The others comprise southern California, southern Chile, a patch of the western Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and 2 fragments of southern Australia. When my students say, well, how can you remember those? I say, go into a wine shop. Look where the wine's coming from. And of course, there's a reason, because those areas were what Alfred Crosby called the Neo-Europes, the places where Mediterranean and other crop regimes were very rapidly transposed and took off, transforming their indigenous societies and populations. The challenges and opportunities created by these kind of semi-arid, fragmented, and year-on-year extremely unpredictable conditions are hardwired into countless interpretations of the structures and practices of Mediterranean societies. So up there, top left, I've simply mapped out the 5 big ones. Over here, a recent example of efforts to map various sort of edges to the Mediterranean through things like where olives grow, where the rainfall is in certain forms, where the plants are of certain types. And the point is not that anything is right or wrong, but that they braid and overlap, and they create a kind of cumulatively plausible arena for analysis. On the right, a whole lot of those individual ways of thinking about the Mediterranean unpacked. Now, critically, the Mediterranean is the only place on the planet where both these individually extremely rare conditions coexist. So really very unusual and interesting theatre, with one tiny exception in a very, very minor key, and that is the California Channel, its islands, and whatever lies underneath modern Los Angeles. If any of you do end up in the Getty or anywhere around there, remember, you're in a Mediterranean zone. You're in about the only area where one of those zones actually overlaps with a coastal and island landscape. And fascinatingly, if you read the ethnography of the pre-contact Native American communities in those islands, they behave quite like people did in the Cyclades about 6,000 years ago. And that's something I'd like to pursue more. It's quite interesting. Well, like maybe people believe, with Leela and Marisa in the room, I hesitate to say quite how people behave, and Peggy and Yorgos in the room, I hesitate exactly how people behave in the Cyclades. But there are some interesting parallels there that one might perhaps learn from. Lastly, of course, if we're looking at the great global coincidences and parameters, from the later 4th millennium BC, the Mediterranean is adjacent to 2 focal areas of the world's earliest cities and states. Moreover, think of the Levant, the tiny scrap, 40, 50,000 square kilometers, bit bigger than the Peloponnese. A crucial region, 4, variously, the origins and or the expansion of early hominins, the expansion of modern humans, still half of the earliest and largest core area heartland of farming in the world, adjacent to 2 of the cores of the earliest cities and states, and later home to 2 and arguably 3 world religions. That's a pretty extraordinary tally for a little scrap of land, right on the edge of the Mediterranean. So clearly the early Mediterranean ought to be a very interesting place indeed, and its takeoff is indeed precociously early, even allowing for growing knowledge of other inland seas. For example, the growing knowledge we have of the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and for me, enduring questions about what on earth is going on in the seas around China from the emergence of the Shang Bronze Age onwards. There must be much more to be picked up there than we're picking up, largely because I think it's all in wood, and it's very, very difficult to actually detect what's going on. The Caribbean, of course, off that map and off in the New World, is on a rather different timetable, simply because people get there a lot later. There's no one in the New World until, well, we still don't know, funnily enough, but something like 15, 16, 17,000 years ago. And let me add one final reason why, for me, as a kind of barbarian northerner, the knowledge of the early Mediterranean matters if we're to navigate our present and build a more viable and tolerant future. And I realise in saying what I'm about to say that much of this will be palpably obvious to an audience of people who live in the Mediterranean. But I will say it nonetheless, because I've tried this idea in Amman, in Ankara, in Valletta, in Lecce, in Rome, and in that famous Mediterranean capital of Brussels. And it's very interesting to see the different takes one gets on how one feels about the Mediterranean present and future. The point is, open the newspaper. Tragedy off the obscure islet of Lampedusa. Capsizing boats packed with North African refugees. An Arab Spring that is turning to bleak midwinter. A crisis in many of the countries of southern Europe. Longer-term issues of ethnic and religious conflict, oil flows, atomic powers, and a looming, growing, long-term water shortage. As long ago as 1998, the then German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer argued in a book called Die Rückkehr der Geschichte that, in translation, the decisive question for Europe in the 21st century is whether the Mediterranean will be a sea of cooperation or a sea of confrontation. And many of you must, I'm sure, be becoming increasingly aware of that today. The Mediterranean's deeper past, of course, offers plenty of examples of the latter, of confrontation and conflict, but overall, and despite popular deployment of its archaeology in the service of all kinds of more or less dodgy nationalist, supranationalist and subnational agendas, the overwhelming message is of a place of meetings, of fluidity, of flux, a place where stereotypes might be born but also constantly undermined and melted down. The early Mediterranean, for me, is in this sense a very good, instructive, and even guardedly hopeful place to think about and study the globalizing world in which we live. In a nutshell, we ignore its past to our poverty and arguably our peril. Now, of course, later historians have risen to this invitation. 2 of the great classics I put up there on the left are called Fernand Braudel's The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II. That was, of course, Philip II of Spain rather than Philip II of Macedon. As many people have joked, I'm not the first to make that terrible pun. But Braudel, of course, might have argued that the whole point of his longue durée perspective on the Mediterranean is perhaps those 2 Mediterraneans weren't as different in their fundamentals as the froth of historical events above them in the age of the expansion of Macedon and the early Habsburg regime in Spain might lead us to think. That, of course, was written long ago in 1949, revised in 1967. More recently, Peregrine Horden and Nicholas Purcell's The Corrupting Sea, which takes, if you like, its focal length as what one might think of as an extended Iron Age, which begins uncontroversially around 1000 BC, but goes on until, let's say, 1300 AD. Basically, the Iron Age, classical Roman and medieval Mediterranean. At the risk of gross oversimplification, they identify 3 common unifying themes that underlie much of human activity in the Mediterranean. These will be familiar to many of you who've engaged with this extraordinary book, but I summarise them very simply as follows. Firstly, the complex, mosaic-like, highly fragmented ecology. I've illustrated that largely just by showing you lots of little landscapes that look very different, and not only different from each other, but internally very different over tiny distances. One that may detain you for a little longer, top right, is a satellite view of the vegetation of the island of Kythera, where, with support from Aris and more latterly from the new members of the Archaeological Service, we've been doing fieldwork for many, many years. There, of course, the point I'm trying to make, or the point that makes, is each of those little pixels indicates a distinctive type of vegetation. Each pixel is 10 metres across. So a large tree will make a pixel. And the point is the extraordinary variety of environments and ecologies that you can see over tiny distances in this part of the world. The second feature that Horden and Purcell identify is the universality of risk, but also opportunity in a highly uncertain environment. That's usually illustrated, as I have on the left, by these kind of terrifying plots of annual rainfall in various parts of the Mediterranean that basically show you have no idea, as a farmer, quite what you're going to get next year. And in some areas it doesn't matter because those plots are sort of above the kind of the harvest fail level. In others, they're right down on the kind of danger line. A converse form of that plot, bottom left, of course, shows the spatial microvariation one gets rather than the interannual one. But I've also tried to put a potentially more positive and maritime take on risk and opportunity. And this comes from a marvellous slide in Renfrew and Wagstaff's book, An Island Polity, that came out in the early 1980s. And it's simply, some of you will know exactly what that is, a wind rose of the direction and intensity of the winds for every month of the year on the Greek island of Milos. Okay? And what you can see is, although you have dominant patterning, the fact is, and all of us who've worked in the Cyclades have experienced this, you have very little idea what's going to happen tomorrow. And you have to be fairly flexible as to what you might want to do tomorrow. And if tomorrow involves having a large cargo you want to flog at the other end, your cargo will be quite diverse in order to cope with the number of ports that you might end up at. And that, again, is an interesting point in terms of the extraordinary diversity of the cargoes of Mediterranean shipwrecks. Think Uluburun, for example, but think onwards until quite late as well. And last but not least, connectivity. One of my favourite slides. An extraordinary image that I discovered in the recent exhibition in the Hayward Gallery in London that's obviously a faithful copy of this illustration from the mid-3rd millennium BC on the island of Naxos. And indeed, if you look at the outboard engine there, you get a very good interpretation of clearly what this little thing that we've all been scratching our heads about for the last 17 years since it was published by Christos Doumas, what it might actually be about. The point is, of course, connectivity, high by land, but particularly by sea. The sea acting as a low-friction, high-fi medium for networks of communication, transmission, and such like. Right, so far so very good. But before all this, both those great works, Brodel and Horden and Purcell, take the basic elements of Mediterranean life as givens. And that's fair enough, because most, if not all of them, were of course in place and widely dispersed and active around the basin by the time the chronological curtain lifts on what they're interested in. But in fact, if we pause and we think about it for a minute, all of those elements were ultimately contingent, historical, gradually accumulating developments. The trade networks, the towns, the technologies, the basic farming and pastoral practices, the value systems, the symbolic and sacred and religious worlds, the modes of consumption, even the distinctive environment we now realize was not eternal. One of the great benefits of us all being very worried about global warming today is a huge amount of money that's going into paleoclimatic reconstruction, finally of a grade and quality that means we can really believe it. And what's coming out from that is that broadly, during the first half of the interglacial in which we live, the Holocene in which we live, the Mediterranean was a warmer, wetter, friendlier place for early farming. And the shift to the kind of regime we live with today happens roughly, it depends where you are, 6,000, 5,000, 4,000 years ago. the transition to the Bronze Age, the Copper Age, and all the changes we see there. Very interesting new development there. And of course, it should be fundamentally obvious that without seafaring, the cultural Mediterranean really cannot exist. Now, when I finally the penny dropped that this was an interesting problematic, I started to look around because I assumed that I must have been missing an extensive literature on precisely this. And I found to my horror that there was very, very little out there actually saying, how did the Mediterranean world come together? The two most interesting works were, most appositely, by French scholars, and one of them is an extraordinary book that some of you may have come across. It's called, in translation, The Mediterranean in the Ancient World. Its original French was Les Mémoires de la Méditerranée. It was written in 1967 to 1968 by Fernand Braudel. He wrote the whole book, decided he didn't like it, stuck it in a drawer, and it was lost for 30 years, and it came out after his death. And so you have this voice of Braudel writing about Aegean and Mediterranean prehistory. Now, 30 years earlier. And oh boy, it's an awful lot more interesting to read today than an awful lot of stuff that comes out in our 21st century. But of course, it is 30, 40 years out of date. The next attempt was by Jean Guillain, who will be familiar to many of you for his work in Cyprus and has also worked extensively in the Western Mediterranean. But I found in a sense that no one had really challenged this as an overall question and problematic. Well, the longer and literally weightier answer that I came up with is in a recently completed book that Vangelis very kindly referred to. Now I'm on a much tighter leash. So what I want to do today is simply to demonstrate how an ambitious and, in a sense, disciplinarily very omnivorous, broad-ranging archaeology that will take any form of data, scientific, literary, visual, excavation, regional, underwater, above water, as part of its grist, part of its remit, can actually delineate the so-called prehistories of many of the great themes that make the Mediterranean what it is. Today, I'm going to focus on simply one of those in particular, the expansion of seafaring and maritime connectivity. It's a nice one because it shows a lot of change over time. It's a question that will be familiar to many of you and will chime in with your own interests and studies, I hope in many cases. If you want in a nutshell, that of course is maritime connectivity is one of the three great themes of the corrupting sea. In terms of the other two great themes, the climatic regime of uncertainty, I've already said, 5,000 to 6,000 years old probably. The mosaic like this, interestingly, far, far older, right back to the Pleistocene. You can still see, at the height of the last ice age, many aspects of that mosaic-like world coming into play. Before I look into the maritime aspect of this, there's just one lingering myth that I'd like to deal with. And that myth is a familiar one. We've all heard it. It's that we simply do not know enough to do this kind of thing. We need to wait. We need to learn more. Well, of course, at one level, that's always going to be true. David Clarke, the great British archaeologist who died tragically young, one of the great heroes of processual new archaeology in Britain, once he has a marvellous line. I think it's in Archaeology, The Loss of Innocence, where he says, we all like to think of the archaeological record as a kind of Swiss cheese, fundamentally solid, with a few awkward holes in it. The archaeological record is nothing of the kind. It's the finest of dusty precipitates floating in an ocean of loss. And of course he's right. But if we don't try to write these prehistories, others will for us. And they'll be an awful lot worse. So we are the people who have to go out there and try to write these prehistories of how the planet got to be in the kind of state it is, often through deep time histories that go back well before the beginnings of writing and well before the familiar later classical and such-like societies that we know so much about. And I've just put up there, in a sense, a spectrum of evidence about how we know about the Mediterranean. I apologise to Vangelis, who's become, in a sense, my totem for archaeological science. There she is, that Vangelis doing archaeological science. But I hope you get the overall idea, the range of archaeological, but also textual and visual evidence that we have that would make most of our colleagues in other parts of the world die of jealousy, frankly. The fact that we not only have standard archaeological preservation looked at in incredible depth, largely due to the kind of deep traditions we have of doing archaeology in this part of the world, but also we have an extraordinary range of freak conditions. volcanic, dry, not only in Egypt, but also in the great dry caves that preserve some of our earliest textiles that we have anywhere around, from southern Israel, from Spain, and such like. We also have, of course, wet conditions, the preservation of things like this log boat in Lake Bracciano, up here, dated to 5,500 BC. Perfectly preserved, intact log boat. I saw it about 3 weeks ago in Rome. There it is, sitting there, a great dugout canoe. And, of course, underwater archaeology, and last but not least, a little bit cheeky, perhaps, to put top centre the Iceman, because he was actually found just on the wrong side of the watershed of the Alps. But we actually know, and this is an example of how good our archaeology is now, we know he was a Mediterranean man. We know that because the pollen found upon him shows he had walked up out of the valleys of the Adige. He was an Italian, badly lost, fatally lost, Neolithic. In a sense, I think of him, not Neolithic, final Neolithic Copper Age. I think of him in a sense as a high-altitude shipwreck. He's one of these that you can think of that and then work on that as one of these extraordinary preservation conditions. So we know extraordinarily large amounts, and we have the capability to deploy them in the Mediterranean with a depth and an accuracy that is missing in any other theatre, I would say, across the planet. The problem, in fact, is that we know instead undigestably vast amounts of information from some privileged areas of the basin, notably here, Greece, where we have an extraordinarily fine grain of detail, Italy and the southern Levant, and really desperately little about a few other areas, particularly, and this is the most fascinating one of all, northern Africa. Both the Nile Delta, where the problem is mud, there's no lack of interest, but there's an awful lot of mud you need to get through, and then the whole coast all the way through to the Strait of Gibraltar, where to put it this way, it was only about 6 years ago that anyone actually looked for and found the first pre-Iron Age domestic cereal anywhere in North Africa west of the Nile Delta. We'll translate that into the kind of angst we get about where we know about a particular island or a particular river valley. That's an extraordinary gap. And that really is a problem. Brodel very interestingly wrote back in 1949, when the Ottoman records of the Mediterranean were a closed book to Western scholars, and he had to guess what the Ottoman world was up to. He guessed back then, as he put it, again very eloquently, that the Ottoman world lived and breathed to the same rhythms as the Christian. And it took 3 decades of his graduate students and the opening up of the Ottoman archives and the growing knowledge of Ottoman sources to prove him right. The point I'm making is I suspect if you took a similar gamble on what's going on in the prehistory of North Africa during what we call the Neolithic, the Copper Age, the Bronze Age, in other parts of the Mediterranean, you would probably be very wrong indeed. And North Africa is really, in a sense, a great frontier for our collective archaeological futures in this part of the world. As I started to look at maritime connections right across the Mediterranean, I started to realize the advantages in terms of understanding parallels and long-term dynamics of standing back and looking at a wider range of common patterns that get missed amidst the detail. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of this course. But before I do, just a few observations about the properties of the Mediterranean as a maritime seafaring theatre, and especially of those extraordinarily important crucial interfaces between the land and the sea. Just a few maps. This is one I came across in the 1989 Blue Plan done by the European Union for thinking about the Mediterranean. We tend to actually scale space in terms of area, how big Greece is, how big the Aegean is. That is the total length of the coastline of the Mediterranean, 46,000 kilometres, more than the circumference of the world, incidentally, if you unravel it. And that's the proportion in every modern nation state. You start to realise that Greece is a third of the Mediterranean coastline. Right? Which, for a start, puts Persian tactics in the early 1st century millennium, I always like a prehistorian, the early 5th century BC in a slightly fresh light, but it also makes one think about preservation of that heritage today and the huge challenge faced by that length of coast to look at. But it also makes you realise that the Aegean is one of the most important places for understanding the interaction between the maritime and the terrestrial worlds. And indeed, to stand back a little bit more, If you throw in the figures for Croatia and for Italy in particular, you realize that 2/3 of the maritime interface in the entire Mediterranean is roughly between Genoa, Marsala, Troy, and Rhodes. And that makes you start breaking down this sea to thinking about all kinds of different ways in which we can think about its maritime potentialities. Another approach that I took with help from Andrew Bevan at the UCL Institute was to try to map out, actually taking an approach that Colin McEvedy in the Penguin Atlas of World History had done back in 1967, just trying to map, and there it's done with darker and darker shading, for the degree to which any part of the coast is complex, crenellated, involving islands and peninsulas. Now, of course, the reason why that matters is where you have a bumpy, island-full coast, that's exactly the kind of place where you get good harbours, where you start to think about going to sea when you move around, rather than travel by land. So it's a kind of cipher for areas that might have a strong maritime orientation. And you might say, well, that's far too simplistic. All I would say is, I first came across a version of this map in an article by Anthony Snodgrass, where he was using it to say, funnily enough, if you look at the hotspots in that map, it looks awfully like the main areas where Greek and Phoenician colonies concentrate. And I found that the same map was actually quite useful for thinking about where the earliest Paleolithic seafaring seemed to be going on. Now, anything that can actually vaguely pretend to explain Iron Age colonization and networking and the origins of Paleolithic seafaring has some explanatory potential, regardless of whether you want to be painted into the corner of being an environmental determinist or not. It also becomes interesting because it highlights certain areas of the Mediterranean that are very different indeed. This is now the second time where Greece and the Aegean starts to look like what one might call a super-Mediterranean. All those properties are there in extraordinary density. And of course, places like the Cyclades and the islands in the middle are right in the heart of that kind of connectivity and that kind of potentiality. But compare much of North Africa. A totally different picture. And indeed, if one's starting to try to chip away at why North Africa is different, that different interaction with coastal populations and coastal potentialities, I think, is very interesting. And indeed, the only areas that come up big at all on the North African coast are the Nile Delta, the area along Tunisia which produces Carthage, and the Strait of Gibraltar, which are about the only three foci I can see of African-oriented seafaring along this coast. And instead, I offer this in parentheses, but something that's become very interesting if one looks at the radical new archaeology being done in North Africa over the last 20 years, is that the focus of North African coastal populations was not the sea to the north, but the desert to the south. And the reason was that for much of the Holocene, that was not a desert. The Sahara, we now realize, did not exist. It was a landscape of savanna, of vast, thin, shallow lakes, of running wadis. That up there is a plot for what the Sahara looked like about 8,000 BC. That lake, that big blue blob there, is called Lake Mega Chad. That's what they call it in the literature. It's 10 times the size of Lake Chad today. It's the size of Italy. Right? That was a concentration point for North African populations, and it's the drying out of that world from 4,000, 3,000 BC that, in a sense, strands populations in the Maghreb and in Cyrenaica in a kind of time warp until Greek and Phoenician Iron Age colonists arrive. The third general point I want to make is how much the distribution of islands matters. I first showed this slide in a lecture in Honolulu to island archaeologists. It was a lecture called Do Islands Really Matter? There were a large number of Caribbean archaeologists there, and I was very lucky that I was actually taking a flight out of Honolulu about 3 hours after the talk, because they became very, very, very angry. And you can see why. The point I was trying to make is not that Caribbean islands don't matter. Of course they matter for Caribbean archaeology and for the prehistory of their own part of the world. The point I was making, and after they get very angry, they still can't answer my question. The point I was making is that how different would the pre-Columbian history of Mesoamerica, the Mayan and Aztec world, of Florida, of northern South America, the Orinoco Valley, how different would they have been if there were no islands in the Caribbean? And the answer, after they get very cross, is not very different. Fascinatingly, within a few decades of Columbus turning up, the Caribbean has become, as you all know from Pirates of the Caribbean and other very historical movies like that, has become a network of connections, slaving, trading, and Atlantic trade. And of course, that is importing a very Mediterranean, ultimately, model for how islands work into the New World. The point I wanted to make in contrast is that it rapidly, if you try to think of the Mediterranean and its prehistory and early history without the islands, it rapidly becomes impossible. And I just put that up with a nice plan of the Punic Empire in about the 6th, 5th centuries BC and how transmarine and insular that phenomenon really is. Right, let's step back a little bit and think in rather more deep time, but also historical terms, about the stages by which the maritime world of the Mediterranean comes together. We can think in notional terms about a series of phases, but I'd like to start with what I think of still, and I may be in a kind of entrenched minority here given recent discoveries, as phase 0. But it seems to me that if you look at the aggregate evidence, the Mediterranean over the longue durée has acted for most of the last 2 million years far more as a barrier than as a bridge to human mobility. And I say that entirely cognizant of recent discoveries on Crete and elsewhere that I think are extremely interesting but still have a lot of questions to answer in terms of quite what, where, how, and also so what, in terms of where we're actually getting with them. It looks to me as if the aggregate evidence shows the expansions of our direct and indirect ancestors around the basin tended to be circum-Mediterranean rather than trans-Mediterranean. And even when we do have evidence for people getting out to the sea or getting onto islands, my question becomes not so much did that occasionally happen or did it not. After all, if you let a whole lot of hominins sit around the basin for 2 million years and the wind blows and trees float around, stuff's going to happen, right? The question for me is much more, does it have a decisive impact on our understanding of mobility, cognition, and the dispersion of ultra-early hominin and other species? There it seems to be the answer is no. And the answer lies with the Neanderthals. Neanderthals are very interesting. I got very into Neanderthals in this book. Neanderthals we think of course, as a cold-loving northern species up there in the kind of transalpine Europe hanging on as the glacial ages came and went. Of course, one of the great discoveries is that the Mediterranean is one of the hearth areas of Neanderthal life, the Middle Paleolithic, basically. Crawling with it, particularly, of course, northern Greece. And that's being replicated all over Mediterranean Europe and right down into the Levant. The Mediterranean Neanderthals probably lived for longer and in greater density than in any other part of their species range. And indeed, a nice little detail, the two nice little details. One, of course, is that the first Neanderthal skeleton was not found in the valley of the Neanderthal, in central southern Germany in 1856. It was actually found, the first skull of a Neanderthal was found in 1848 at Gibraltar. And because 1848 was a year of political revolutions, not ones in human evolution, that was put into a drawer, quietly forgotten about, and we lost the chance to call that species Homo gibraltarensis, which would give us a very different understanding and framework for thinking about Neanderthals. The other point about Neanderthals is that they and we shared a common ancestor on both sides of the Mediterranean 500,000 years ago. The evolution of us into us in Africa and them into Neanderthals in Europe is unthinkable without some massive, in a sense, biogeographical barrier between the two to stop interbreeding of any significant level until the final encounter. What was that barrier? It was the sea. Mediterranean Neanderthals are created, really, by the Mediterranean, and they live there longer than in any other part of their range. For me, the real shift in the range and frequency to something that we might think of as actual seafaring still happens in the last millennia before the end of the last ice age and the beginning of our own Holocene interglacial, some 13,000 years ago. This, of course, has long been demonstrated by the famous finds of Melian obsidian in the latest Paleolithic, upper Paleolithic levels of the Frankie Cave. It's also illustrated by the finds of Mitokremnos and other finds on Cyprus and now elsewhere in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. And it's worth noting that whether or not our ancestors did in fact bump off the last of these cute little pygmy hippopotami on Cyprus, is actually irrelevant to the fact that the upper levels of the Itacoan Lost Rock Shelter are clearly anthropogenic and clearly have abundant human remains well dated. The wider generalization of this baseline proficiency in seafaring is associated with the spread of farming, which transformed Mediterranean culture and demography forever. A statement I think we can all agree on, regardless of whether we think it is something independently invented or brought around and diffused by migrant farmers. And what's interesting about the kind of patterns we get now is that this is the first time in the whole history of the Mediterranean that we see, in a sense, a trans-Mediterranean phenomenon, not a circum-Mediterranean one. It's like turning a coat the other way round, so that it works from the centre outwards. And the easiest way of thinking about that is if you think about the landfall areas of early farming in all the great peninsulas of the Mediterranean. They start in the south and centre of each peninsula and then work upwards, out of the Mediterranean, into the Balkans, up towards the Pyrenees, up towards the Alps, right? Whilst, of course, the way that works in the Paleolithic is going round and then coming down into those. So a place like southern Italy would be the last refuge for Neanderthals, for hyenas, for lions, for hippopotami, all kinds of stuff. It's a bridgehead for Italian farming. And that means a totally different way for this basin to work. Incidentally, if you think we still need to know more about the Mediterranean, where else in the world, could you possibly map that? That's century by century contours for the expansion of farming through the Mediterranean, done by the French. Extremely impressive, fine-grained stuff. You can see the speed picking up once you get this sort of pause as you get across into western Greece, and then the speed with which it's getting out into the Tyrrhenian, and then all the way round to the Atlantic for southern Spain. The kind of details that the French are doing again here to show, this is fascinating, two landfall early farming sites next to each other in southwestern France. From the micro details of the pottery styles and the lithics, you can tell that one of those neighbouring communities came hopping along the coast, as you might expect from Provence. The other one had transferred directly out of the Tyrrhenian Islands. Again, we're close to being able to do that in places like Thessaly as well. We will be there very soon, I think, indeed. And of course, the final point is that this is indisputably a largely maritime phenomenon. We know that farming reached Cyprus. We used to get very excited about Crete. It reached Cyprus about 8,200 BC, possibly earlier. And it was seaborne hops that took farming to Sicily, to Corsica, Sardinia, and right the way along the long shore of southern France and Spain. Getting into times and periods and questions that will be more familiar to many of you, the next really big phase in the big history of Mediterranean seafaring begins around what I now like to think of as what I call the long third millennium BC. And I call it the long, but it allows me, taking a leaf out of Hobbes' form, of course, it allows you to actually include the later fourth, which seems to me to be working from about 3,500 to about 2,000 as a package of time. Prehistory, of course, doesn't always work with the millennia we impose on it. But that long third millennium is characterized at sea by a surge in the voyaging range that we see, or the seafaring range, a much greater ideological inflection, much more esteemed social practices that we can think of as voyaging. And of course, this is when our first depictions, now move back to Strophilas in the 4th millennium BC, start to actually crop up. But what really struck me is that once you start to look across the whole Mediterranean, you realize that that horizon of illustration of boats is actually striking right the way across. It's the same in Malta, it's the same in Egypt, it's the same in the Levant. And these are people who've been going to sea for thousands of years on craft they never draw. The fact they start to draw them now, for me, says they're drawing these not to help us. Of course, they're drawing these because they're starting to become ideologically, symbolically important in their worlds. And seafaring is doing something slightly different from what it was doing before. And indeed, once one starts to look around, you see all kinds of other indices and indications of a new set of seafaring practices. Now, a lot of you will be familiar with the work that several of us have done in the Aegean and the Aegean Islands, but it's a much bigger pattern. And that was one of the great breakthroughs when one started reading the literature on Spain, on Italy and such like. For example, it's around 2400 BC that the first people ever to reach the Balearic Islands get there. They're the largest patch of Mediterranean land not to feel a human footfall in the entire basin. People come barreling in with full farming packages about 2400, 2300 BC. That used to be dated much, much earlier. That's all been cleaned up by radiocarbon dating and looks a pretty good pattern. We know all about voyaging in the Cyclades and the other Aegean islands. Look at that tiny island top center, top right, Palagrucia. Tiny scrap of rock in the middle of the Adriatic, 50, 60 kilometers from anywhere. You can see how small it is by that boat, which is quite a large boat, going round it. There's a lighthouse that you can in fact hire off the Croatian tourist board and go and stay there for the week because no one will come back and there's no food and there's no water. That's remote. One or two scraps of early Neolithic pottery as a stepping stone across the Adriatic on their way to the Tavolieri, the great plain of southern Italy, the kind of Thessaly of southern Italy, and then silence archaeologically on that island for 2,000 or 3,000 years. Third millennium BC, thousands and thousands of decorated, highly decorated bowls, beautifully knapped stone arrowheads. The main guy actually publishing this, Stasra Forenbacher, a Croatian archaeologist, emailed me the other day and said, I'm kind of interested in what all everyone's saying about Keros, you know, remote island, with all kinds of things being brought to it. So my first answer was, where's your pottery coming from? Have you done petrography? Not yet. Interesting, though. So this is a kind of phenomenon that we're seeing. It's not the same as Keros, it's a different thing. But it is the same idea of remote islands becoming central places for ritual, trade, exchange, whatever it might be, and more besides. It's, of course, at this time that we get the international spirit, as Colin Renfrew first named it. What is less well known is actually at the same time, this is the Belgica expansion of the Western Mediterranean, which makes the international spirit of the Aegean look quite parochial. This is the completely unknown one called the Cetina culture. Josef Maran is the main person who's pioneered awareness of that in Aegean circles, late 3rd millennium BC, some of the stuff that produces those weird EH3 pots that you see in the Western Peloponnese. Cetina was more or less an invisible archaeological phenomenon during the Cold War because archaeologists working on each side of the Adriatic were on the front line of the, well, not of the Warsaw Pact entirely, of Tito's Yugoslavia and the West. Once that ended, people started crossing in. They realized you had a wide phenomenon there that is explaining, to put it back in Aegean terms, for example, why you get those strange incised bone tubes in Malta, Puglia, Lerna, and Troy. That's one of those strange, early connections that's not what you'd expect and is tied together by really the meeting point between these two interaction zones. It's also at this stage that we start to see the first specialized island trading centers. Now, we're all familiar, many from the room have dug, several of you have dug these in the Cyclades. Less familiar, and this really made my hair stand on end when I thought about it, because this is interesting. Tyre. Go down through the Phoenician, Bronze Age levels, bedrock, early bronze. Why do you go to live on a little grotty reef a few meters above the sea off the Levantine coast? It's a kind of Mochnos. It's a kind of island centre. Cadiz at the other end, two sites that will be actually united by the Phoenicians, Copper Age pottery on there too. Little islands are becoming places to go out to and live on and trade from at this stage. And of course, it's always the exceptions that prove the rule. Two island societies in particular that have, up to this point in time, managed to tread, in a sense, a very different social and cultural path from the mainstream and create very, very idiosyncratic, strange island societies. At this stage, by the later 3rd millennium, have been brought, by one process or other, right back into the mainstream. The two I'm thinking of, they're at opposite ends of the Mediterranean, and they're different in size and different in history, but they are extremely similar in what happens to them in the late 3rd millennium BC. Malta and the great temple culture of so-called Neolithic Malta, 3,500 to 2,500 BC, and of course the ending, interpretively controversial, of the strange Copper Age societies, the Chalcolithic, of Cyprus, which, Cyprus is a very interesting case. In the 9th millennium BC, it's at the cutting edge of farming in the Western world. By the 4th and 3rd, they're still in roundhouses and eating venison, whilst just over the water, herbalism and estate and writing are about to take off. And what you see in both these islands is by about 2,200 BC, 2,300 BC, they've been dragged kicking and screaming back in to the mainstream, back into a Bronze Age. however that happened, it gives us a kind of scary message. It's a sort of you can run but you can't hide message. And it's a darker side of globalization. One of the great dangers of talking about connectivity. We all love the word connectivity. It's all a good thing, isn't it? And it's connectivity, it's the internet, it's Facebook, it makes you all feel marvelous. Connectivity is also the hoplites and the triremes landing on your shore and enslaving you all. Connectivity is also not being able to be different when you want to. We're all enmeshed and trapped as much as freed by connectivity, and that's one of these things you start to see kicking in by this stage in the prehistoric Mediterranean. Now, the final phase, of course, is, again, beginning in the 3rd millennium BC in the easternmost Mediterranean, between the Nile and the Levantine coast, and then expanding outwards. And this is the invention and dispersion of a new sailing ship technology. In a sense, the prototypes of these capital-intensive, extraordinary machines that tied the Mediterranean, and indeed, until the age of steam, the entire world together. And it's interesting when one looks at pictures like, for example, the Sauhure ships, mid-3rd millennium BC from a tomb in Egypt, a replica here of a slightly later ship, the ship of Hatshepsut, an early New Kingdom female pharaoh. That slide was sent to me by a colleague, sent me an email sometime in the midwinter a few years ago, and the email was entitled What I Did on My Summer Holidays. And I thought it would be the usual kind of debauched pictures of people on the beach. And it was a lovely thing. You clicked on that, and up came that 50% scale, you know who that is, remodeling of an Egyptian punt ship at sail on the Red Sea. These are probably, not definitely, but probably the earliest sailing ships, late 4th, early 3rd millennium BC, anywhere in the world. And I would argue, in a sense, that if you want to understand the emergence of the Levant as a maritime corridor, it's not something that's particularly topographically evident or evident during the Neolithic. It's something that starts anew when the Levant begins to adopt a new position as the intermediary between two emergent superpowers in the 4th and 3rd millennia BC, Egypt and Mesopotamia. One with its own desirable resources and shipbuilding potential, cedar of Lebanon. Cheops' ship, after all, is made of imported cedar of Lebanon. And it's this set of relations that transform an otherwise rather unprepossessing straight piece of coast into what we can think of as the Phoenician shore, avant la lettre. Now, over the next 1.5 to 2,000 years, sailing ships are stagily adopted across the Mediterranean, all the way to Gibraltar and indeed beyond. And interestingly, they seem to come in, usually quite closely in step with the expansion of social complexity, the state, and large-scale enterprise and trading enterprise. The best example, of course, being those early depictions of sails in the seal stones of early Middle Minoan Crete. Their performance both boosted cargo and shrank the Middle Sea. And there you see, for example, examples below in Uluburun of the kind of scale of cargo that would be unthinkable without sail-driven shipping. Translate that into grain. You could not have those cities on the sea. This is so typical of the classical, archaic, classical and Roman world without sailing ships. But they're also distance shrinkers. And if you were looking at the upper map and thinking that it looks rather odd, it does look rather odd. And again, it's an experiment. It's an experiment in saying, if sailing ships only gradually expand across the Mediterranean from east to west, and if their role is to shrink the experienced scale of distance, what, say halfway through that process, when sail-driven shipping is endemic in the east, incipient in the centre, and unknown in the west, what will be the experienced scale of space? And you get a rather interesting result. But the eastern Mediterranean, which we always think of as a great world of the Bronze Age palaces, is actually the little frog pond. The western Mediterranean, which is still in its megalithic early Bronze Age, is really oceanic, almost. And that again gets one to think differently. If you want a kind of global comparison, this is a marvellous slide. It's a slide of a marvellous plot by Athol Anderson, the Pacific archaeologist. What he's doing there, don't be baffled by the initial complexity. These are thousands of years ago, and these are distances of longest attested crossing. And you have one graph for Oceania, the Pacific, You have one graph for the North Atlantic, and you have the other graph that doesn't work for the Caribbean. And what's interesting is each case where you have a massive arrow, that's where sailing ships come in, and the scale of maximum distance just goes crazy. Okay? And that's what gets people across the Pacific. It's what gets people, Vikings, across the North Atlantic, Columbus in their footsteps. And it never seems to happen in the Caribbean until contact. That is a kind of impact we should expect of distance shrinking in the Mediterranean. But I want to end, in a sense, firstly by giving you a very cumulative map of how I see this Middle Sea starting to connect and draw together through seafaring. And these maps are purely empirical. They're a work in progress based on what I can see of the evidence for sea crossing, maritime activity. Firstly, before 6000 BC, so before farming west of here, between about 6000 and 3000 BC, broadly the Neolithic, very crudely. The long third millennium, the early Bronze Age and the Copper Age, where you can see substantial expansion, and the picture between 2000 and roughly 1300 BC, just before that final push of, say, Cypriot long-range trading in the last centuries of the Bronze Age. And the point one wants to make by the end is you've only got a couple of open shore routes to fill, and a bit of the North African shore, until to actually get the Phoenician Mediterranean. And the point to make, I think, is we often think of Phoenicians as initiators, as pioneers, as somehow more able through various navigational techniques to sail than anyone else. I like to think of Phoenicians as much as a consequence, as a creation of thousands of years of accumulating knowledge and experience from all over the Mediterranean, as an ethnic label that must hide actually vastly more complex realities. As Nicholas Purcell once put it, what do you think of a Phoenician living in northern Sardinia, whose grandmother came from locally, whose grandfather came from Carthage? What is that kind of person, ethnically, culturally, etc.? But we'll end not with Phoenicians, but with another surrogate, and one of my favourites. Musculus domesticus, the house mouse. And this is an example of the extraordinary stories that we can get about Mediterranean connectivity from very, very unexpected sources. The house mouse is a species that we know as commensal, and that means in very simple terms that it cannot exist except in close proximity to settled human communities. The house mouse is an invention, if you like, of the Neolithic, as is the house sparrow. However, it also has its enemies, and other species of mouse will keep it out of areas unless it can get over in overwhelming numbers and overwhelmingly favourable circumstances. People have plotted the expansion of the house mouse over time through the Mediterranean. And this is an extraordinary parable. Starting up there, we're before even the beginning of the early farming and pre-farming period. All the house mice are, of course, in the Levant, in the Natufian and pre-pottery Neolithic PPNA, PPNB zone. 8,500 to 6,000 BC, the house mouse gets to Çatalhöyük. Interestingly, no one in Çatalhöyük ever painted the house mouse. They painted bulls, although there were probably far more house mice than there were bulls there, and they were probably far more important to whether they survived the next winter than lots of wild aurochses that you try to kind of grapple to the ground to show what a big man you were. The house mouse also, interestingly, manages to get to Cyprus, almost certainly in the bilges of the canoes that were not only getting there, but getting there often enough to keep replenishing these mouse populations. Then silence, 6,000 to about 2,500 BC. Possible mouse at Knossos, I believe, but because we don't actually have the skull, we're not quite sure. 2,500 to 1,000 BC, the mouse moves west. One of the mice gets to Comoros, perfect. One of the great dynamic international port sites of the southern Mediterranean. The other mouse I put there is the most unlucky mouse that we know of archaeologically. It's a mouse that jumped onto the Uluburun ship at its penultimate, ultimate, I suppose, port of call. And actually, people are so good at studying these mice now. If it's what turns you on, you can do a lot with house mouse remains. by studying the details of the molar teeth of these particular house mice, you can prove that that mouse is of the subspecies of house mouse that exists only in the northern Levant. Read Ugarit. That mouse jumped onto the ship at Ugarit. Now you combine that with where the copper comes from, the northern southern Levantine origins of the storage jars, and you start to pick up a much richer idea of where this ship has come from. And then, of course, the final stage of the story, in the last millennium BC, the house mouse storms the Western Mediterranean. I should say, incidentally, these dots are only new finds. Obviously, I once gave this lecture to a very broad audience. They said, so the mice kind of all leave the Eastern Mediterranean, they all move western. Obviously, I shouldn't need to say that. It's kind of mass migration, westward sweep of the mouse. Obviously not. But the idea is, here you suddenly see with a burgeoning of traffic. It's not simply farming and settlement, it's a burgeoning of maritime traffic. So the house mouse storms the beaches of Corsica, of Iberia, of France, and heaven forfend it gets to the very edge of the English Channel, and will indeed, as I know all to my chagrin, eventually cross that channel and infest our own island. A few giant leaps and many, many tiny scuttles and jumps. For the house mouse, and indeed for me, not a bad metaphor for Mediterranean collectivity. Thank you.